Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into Tisha B'Av, a day of destruction and hope. Let's get started. For many of my Jewish listeners, you might be aware that today, the day I'm recording this, is Tisha B'Av. For those of you who are not Jewish, who may be not so familiar with the Jewish calendar or Jewish holidays, Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the month of Av. To you, if you aren't aware, you might think, what makes this day special? And why is it important on the Jewish calendar that it is a holiday? So Tisha B'Av is one of the most important holidays to Jewish people, in addition to the regular high holidays, because this one day seems to be almost like the nexus of the Jewish universe. For some reason, this day seems to echo throughout eternity, and today is that day. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about what Tisha B'Av is, what has happened throughout the ages on this specific day, and maybe what lessons it can show for the future. And thinking about what's happening today, maybe what this is a little bit of a sign of. Now, as a scholar, in addition to a person who practices Judaism, obviously some of this stuff is based on tradition and Judaism and not so much necessarily provable facts. It's based on faith in many ways. So we're going to touch a little bit on the history, but also the faith side of it. One of the first recorded incidents of the 9th of Av is supposedly the story from the book of Numbers, chapter 14, where Joshua and Caleb go out into the land of Canaan along with a number of other spies in order to scope out the land for the Israelite people. Now, if you know your history, the Israelite people left Egypt, wandered the desert, and then were coming towards the land of Canaan in order to be given it by God. So Moses sends a bunch of spies out into the land in order to report back what they see. And out of all of the spies, unfortunately, some of them came back with some negative feedback. It's too dangerous. There are people in the land. We can't take them on. They're very militarized. Who are we? We're just a bunch of Israelites in the desert. They didn't really have the faith in God. Whereas Joshua and Caleb came back after hearing all of these people speaking so poorly and said that the land that they saw is very good. It is filled with many good things. And if God is pleased with us, he will help us in taking the land. They had a much different view of what they had seen. Of course, this kind of goes without saying that people have different perceptions. Someone who looks at it positively and has some faith might have a very different view than someone who looks at everything and is always negative and doesn't think that it's possible. And it is really unfortunate that because of the way the spies reacted, everybody other than Joshua and Caleb, the Israelites were forced to unfortunately wander the desert a little longer. Clearly, they didn't have faith in God. Clearly, they didn't have faith in when he promised them this land and told them after everything he had done for them, I am going to help you take this land. And they didn't have faith. And it's because of that moment, they didn't believe in God right before they were about to get into the promised land. They were sent to wander the desert a little longer. So the first recorded situation of the 9th of Av is supposedly the time that they came back and reported, and they were forced to then wander for 40 more years. It is not a positive thing that the Jewish people or the early Israelites didn't believe in God as much as they should have, and they were slightly punished for that. And their children eventually made their way into the land of Canaan, which then turned into Israel. So this story kind of goes along with every other story I'm about to tell you, which is the lack of faith in God and trusting the process. And when you see something that looks bad and just being pessimistic about it versus optimistic about it, you will definitely hear a theme throughout this podcast episode. But that's not the only time something bad happened to the Jews on the 9th of Av, which is why we remember it. On the 9th of Av, in the year 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple, the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, a temple which stood in Jerusalem as the house of God for over 410 years. Just prior to the Babylonian destruction of the temple, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been warned and got exiled by the Assyrian Empire. Judah was spared thanks to the work of the prophets, getting the Judean people to repent. But unfortunately, that didn't last very long, as the Judean people then turned away from God yet again, and then the Babylonians took over. And the temple's destruction is on the 9th of Av. The Jewish people learned an unfortunate lesson that they hadn't learned in the first incident on 9th of Av, and they again didn't listen to God and turn their back on God, and unfortunately the first temple was destroyed, and many of the elites were forced into Babylonian exile. To describe this as a traumatic event for the Judean people would be an understatement. Not only was their temple destroyed, something they had been working for thousands of years as a people, but then to be exiled from their land, which is central to their religion. This was undoubtedly one of the worst situations that the Judeans could ever face. But it wasn't the only time that this would happen, because as we know, the Judeans eventually came back to the land under the Cyrus decree, which allowed them from Persia to leave and come back, and the temple was rebuilt. The second temple stood right in the spot that the first temple did, just like God promised the Jewish people. But unfortunately, this wouldn't last too long, because unfortunately the Romans took over, as we all know, and Roman influence, Roman religion, Jews turning away from God and towards this Roman paganism became a really big issue. On the 9th of Av, the exact same day, in the year 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. The temple that once stood in Jerusalem. You can still see the Herodian retaining walls, known as the Western Wall today, of the Second Temple. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can still see in the area to the southwest of the Western Wall the massive stones that were thrown down from the temple thousands of years ago. So on this incredibly dark day, we had two temples destroyed on the same day, according to tradition, and it was like an echo through the ages. It's probably not an accident that it happens on the exact same day, multiple times. It is a lesson to be learned here. So it's bad enough that we had two temples destroyed on the same day, supposedly according to tradition, but it's not the only situation that occurs on the 9th of Av. Following the destruction of the Second Temple and the complete control of the area by Rome, the Jews rebelled, numerous times actually, and the Bar Kokhba revolt that took place, a Jewish man some believed at the time to be the Messiah, or a possible Messiah, led a revolt against the Roman emperor. And he was successful, believe it or not. He was so successful that he actually even had a chance to mint coins for his new Judean state, free of Rome. Hopes were high that things were going to get better, the Romans were going to be gone, and the Jews would be able to recreate their temple and bring God back to the land. But unfortunately, that didn't work out too well, because on the 9th of Av, the Battle of Beitar was lost. This is known as one of the last failures, unfortunately, of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Battle of Beitar, that ended his revolt once and for all, and sealed the fate of the Judean people to live under Rome and under colonization. And of course, this happened, supposedly, on the 9th of Av, in the year 133. And if we get way further into Jewish history, there are other events that seem to always echo on the 9th of Av. For example, in the year 1290 CE, the Jewish people were expelled from England on Tisha B'Av. In the year 1290, King Edward I of England expelled all Jews from England on July 18th, which was Tisha B'Av. This marks the first time a European country expelled its Jewish population. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last time that any of these countries did it, including England multiple times. But the first time the Ashkenazi Jews, since leaving Rome as slaves, made their way to Europe, this was the first incidence of being kicked out of a country. The English, of course, blamed it on economic reasons, but typically it was always about anti-Semitism, let's be real. You don't kick the Jews out for no reason, it's anti-Semitism. But sadly, this 9th of Av, the first time the Jewish people were kicked out of a European country, echoed many times over, being kicked out of multiple countries for similar reasons. So it's not really a surprise that would happen on one of the most important days of destruction, the 9th of Av. I'm sure the King of England didn't realize that at the time, but maybe God has a bigger picture here, trying to teach a lesson. Maybe the Jewish people shouldn't be in Europe getting too comfortable. and they should be heading back home. And maybe we should stop being surprised at this point that again on Tisha B'Av in 1492, the Sephardic Jews were expelled from a country. Many of you probably have heard the 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that old rhyme. But for Jewish people, the 9th of Av in 1492 is the day that the Jews were formally expelled from Spain by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. They were banished from the land on March 31st, which again was the 9th of Av. And a fun side note, it has recently been discovered that it's not an accident that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue at that same time, because records show that Christopher Columbus very likely was Jewish, and many people on his boat when he sailed were also Jewish, and they were leaving to the New World because of the ban on Jews in Spain. And in one last example of something that really seems incredible that it was on the 9th of Av that it happened, because obviously the people who did it really didn't have a reason to choose that day. It seems like a higher power was involved. In 1942, in Poland, the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto started on the 9th of Av. July 22nd, 1942, Jewish people from the Warsaw Ghetto were starting to be taken to the Treblinka extermination camp. The Warsaw Ghetto, being the largest of the ghetto systems in Nazi-occupied Poland, on the 9th of Av was the day that the Nazis decided to start taking people out of that camp and sending them to their death. A system that will see roughly 900,000 Jews killed in gas chambers. And maybe not coincidentally, that same Warsaw Ghetto, the same 9th of Av, is the day that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising officially began. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that consisted of Jewish groups in Warsaw Ghetto taking on the German military and holding them off for a month, longer than the Polish army, something that is still echoed through the ages of the Jewish people. I didn't want this episode to be a downer, just talking about all the times that the Jews had been kicked out of countries, our temples destroyed, colonizers taking over our land. It wasn't intended to be so negative. But let's be honest, the 9th of Av technically is a very depressing event. It's why Jewish people around the world right now are currently fasting in remembrance of the temple and all of these issues. There is something about this day that is very important, that God is pointing at and saying, this day is important. It's not a coincidence that all of these things seem to happen on this specific day. As difficult of a day as this is, and having to remember all of these horrible times for the Jewish community, it doesn't go without a little bit of joy. If you know the Jewish community, you know we find joy in everything and hope in everything. And according to some strands of Judaism, they believe that the 9th of Av is not an accident. It is meant to be this way, to remind us, to wake us up. But also, the 9th of Av, apparently, is the day the Messiah is going to be born. And it's going to be the starting point of the better times that we're expecting. Rebuilding the temple, bringing the Jews back to the land of Judea, the end of war, the end of conflict, the end of anti-Semitism. So we look at this day as a horrible tragedy of the Jewish community, but also a day of hope that this could be the end of this horrible situation. And today, being the 9th of Av, it's not hard to realize that we are currently seeing things that look pretty bad. The levels of anti-Semitism we're seeing in the Western world is off the charts. Honestly, I wonder if it's as bad or worse than during the Holocaust. Because even back during the Holocaust, at least the governments weren't supporting it. Whereas now it kind of feels like they are. I mean, the Western governments who clearly pretend to care about the Jews while allowing anti-Semitism to spread like wildfire. We see these Western useful idiots saying they want to make a state for these terrorists in the West Bank and in Gaza, people who have not agreed to any form of peace. People who are currently still holding our hostages and starving them to death. We're giving them a state. It feels like all hope is lost. It is really difficult not to be down and sad and realize that this is probably the same thing that the Bar Kokhba people saw when his revolt was failing. The people around during the Jewish temple, the first and the second, when they were being destroyed, they thought their lives were over. This is not the first time the Jewish people have felt this way. The Jews of Spain and England, as they're kicked out of their country, these would have been earth-shattering issues for them. there is no doubt they would have felt like we're feeling today. And this is why the 9th of Av is so important. To remember that this is an echo throughout the ages, the same feelings throughout all of Jewish history. We are not alone. Our ancestors are with us. There's a very interesting story that comes out of the Talmud. And it's a story about a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Akiva. He comes from Israel back when the Romans controlled it. And the story is that he was traveling with his donkey, his lantern, and a rooster. And he went on his way to find a city that he can sleep for the night. And unfortunately, apparently, no one wanted to let him sleep in their city. And he was kind of down. He thought, I'm going to be sleeping outside in the wild. This isn't great. What am I going to do? And he said, everything God does is for the best. And so he went and spent the night in a field outside of the city. And in the middle of the night, a wind blew and his lamp blew out. And so he was left in complete darkness. And he said, everything God does is for the best. And then as the night passed on, his rooster gets eaten by a fox. And so now his rooster is gone. And his response was, everything God does is for the best. And lastly, as the sun is going to come up shortly, his donkey is eaten by a lion. Once again, the rabbi says, everything God does is for the best. And when he woke up in the morning and looked down towards the city that he was supposed to be staying in the night before, apparently that city had been utterly destroyed overnight. Bandits had gone in, ruined the camp, set it on fire, and took people hostage. All of the things that had happened the night before wasn't an accident. His light being extinguished was to hide him in the darkness from those mobs of people. The rooster being eaten made sure that there wouldn't be any sounds that would give away his position. And the donkey, the same. Had the donkey been alive, maybe he would have made some noises and the people would have come and killed or taken Rabbi Akiva. The point of this story is that when things get really bad, you might not realize that there's a bigger picture here and that things are happening for a reason. We may not understand that, like Rabbi Akiva didn't understand it. But in the end, we'll find out that it turns out it actually saved his life. And maybe this is all going to be for the best for us. So we have to remember everything God does, even the bad stuff, must be for the best. In the end, this 9th of Av is a really important one because it feels like all of the others. Previous years, a couple years ago, we probably wouldn't have thought of 9th of Av other than in the past. Whereas this year, we're kind of feeling it in the present. We're seeing the same things that our ancestors saw on the 9th of Av. And it's scary. But one thing that we have to remember, if we're finding a silver lining in this, is the fact that we're still here in 2025, the 9th of Av. There have been many 9ths of Avs that we've survived as Jewish people. And that is an incredible thing. No matter how bad things got, no matter how much destruction, we somehow survived. And even if we can't understand right now why the things are happening that are happening, hopefully we have to pray that there's a bigger picture here and this is all for the best. And maybe if we're lucky, the 9th of Av is the starting point to this big change. And according to those religious people who believe in the 9th of Av as the day the Messiah is to be born, maybe today's the day. Maybe this is the beginning. I don't know. But hopefully this day, the 9th of Av, is not only remembered as a day of destruction, but starts becoming the day of hope. The starting point that one day we will look back to and realize this is where the hope began. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.